Everyone, welcome to Cloud Masters. I'm Matan Bordeaux alongside my co-host Sam Clark, and we're continuing from our last FinOps episode with Ian Hart, where we previously explored how cloud basically transformed traditional financial models, going from fixed, maybe capital expenses to more variable-based, consumption-based spending. So today we're going to dive into tagging strategies. Specifically, Ian, you shared with us in the past that you strongly believe finance teams should lead the tagging strategy rather than IT and engineering departments. So maybe before the pitchforks come out, can you explain why you believe that finance must drive this process?
Okay, maybe not lead, but they should certainly participate. I think
Participate. Okay.
but more than just turn up. I think that first of all, we talked about the issues that the using the cloud presents to finance. So all the kind of variable cost things, all the cost appearing from nowhere, and the instability, all those issues. And FinOps, without going into detail, FinOps has lots of ways of addressing those particular problems, but it all starts with identification of costs. And tagging is your most basic enabler for cost visibility, right? And so it's very important, I think, when you deploy any resource into the cloud, then there needs to be some kind of understanding from a finance perspective as to what that resource is. And so when you're coming up with a tagging strategy, I think it's very common to come up with, tagging strategies that include a business element. Some it might be 5 tags that have a business element. I'm just not convinced that the business is involved in setting the value of those tags, and they should be. So if you deploy something, then you need to be aware that finance has to understand what that is and why it's there. Now, they're not going to do that from a technical perspective. So the easiest way they're going to do it is from understanding through tagging, through reporting, through the financial reporting, that the sort of thing that the DCI console will do. They need to understand what it is. And so there's a real need for a seat at the table. That's why I think that it's I like the idea of them driving, but obviously they're not going to do the tagging, right? So finance is not going to do the tagging, but and it's IT teams, but finance needs to keep them honest, and they do need to be involved in setting what those tags should be, and in being involved in that conversation.
So for those who maybe are listening, they're like, yeah, whatever. I'm not like in your dreams, or it's not realistic. Maybe what visibility do they lose if they're not involved in that process? If they're not at the table, if they're not driving tagging strategy, or at least informing some of it with the business and financial requirements that engineering doesn't or may not have access to or may not know about.
So I think that if you think about tagging, it's almost like if you go back to a pre-cloud era, it's almost like the process of funding approval. We go in the old days, you would do that process. You would go to finance and you would tell them, "Here's something." They would understand the value. Somebody would be stumping up the cost, so they'd be involved. There'd be a budget holder, and you'd go through this multi-dimensional process where you'd come out with a result that you were happy about, right? And I think that that way, finance has an idea about what's out there and what it's costing. If you don't have this mapping to business resources, if you don't have this mapping to things that finance can understand and therefore understand the value and therefore make value decisions about, you're effectively going through a funding round without involving finance. You're deploying stuff out there that finance doesn't know about, and what's going to increase the lack of stability? Or decrease stability? What's going to decrease your ability to predict? And we're obviously living right now I'm not going to get political, but we're in a Trump age. And one of the things you hear most of all, whether you wholeheartedly agree or wholeheartedly disagree with the kind of tariff process, but most of the issues you hear from businesses is that it's not stable, that it keeps changing. Now, this might be a technique, but from a business perspective, this is what impacts them most. Not whether it's one idea or the other idea. It's the concept that it's not predictable, and it's not something that they can build their understanding, that they can build their financial planning on. And so it's absolutely key. So if you take away that connection of finance to understanding what resources are, you sort of, you're undermining that stability. You're making it much harder for the business to operate as a business, and that means it's going to be less successful.
I think in the last episode, you mentioned the importance of understanding the things that would hurt if they were shut off or stopped. And that's like the key to driving, if you're from the perspective of finance, driving an effective tagging strategy. Could you maybe elaborate more on what you mean by things that
Yeah.
hurt if stopped and how that connects?
Well, it is. I confess, a slightly flippant statement, but I think this is what I do hear quite a lot. It's how do I match this to business benefits? If you say this, it's really easy to say, but how do I match this to business benefits? I mean, the answer to that really is you involve finance in the discussion. You tell finance what something is and what it's serving, and let them tell you how they want you to tag it. So I think this is the process, but and it is all a process, right? This is the first thing. It's a thing that a team should do. It's a thing that a team made up of people from different disciplines should do. So, yes, if you want to know the value of something, switch it off. You'll find out very quickly who shouts the loudest. Clearly, that's a slightly destructive way. So you try and do that effectively, that process, through a collaborative discussion. And this is what it all comes down to. And I think this is why things like progress KPIs are very important. So first of all, for everybody to understand what they're looking at, but you also need to understand just how complete that picture is. So those are things that you need to discuss as well. And really, I think that you start with, if the approach is to start with what matters the most. And this clearly is, if you're talking about something which consumes most of the cloud resources, then clearly this is the important thing, or the thing which pulls in the most customer revenue, or the thing, whatever it is that matters most to the business. This is the obvious candidate to start with. But it is all a process, and it is something that should be done, or should be completed as a collaboration. And I think that how you tag things, how the business wants you to tag things, that's going to develop as well as they understand more what IT is doing. And they don't need to know the technicalities of the cloud, but just working within that kind of exercise in identifying cost, finance is going to start to understand a little bit more about how cloud underpins those services, and IT is going to understand a little bit more about what finance needs. And this does make for a much, much, much better tagging strategy, where it's not just, I've got a few tags that are finance tags, whatever, cost center, that'll do. But they're much more involved in delivering to the business that understanding of what cost is, underpinning some of those business services and business benefits and all that kind of good stuff.
I think one good example of, rather than the approach of turning things off and seeing what hurts, we've all lived through in fairly recent memory, the pandemic and the shutdowns and so on. I was talking with an account manager at a cloud service provider who had a customer that was involved in the travel industry, and they were spending hundreds of thousands of dollars per month on the cloud. And of course, when COVID hit and everything locked down, travel globally dropped to zero. But they didn't know from these hundreds of thousands of dollars what they could scale down, what they could switch off, and what they couldn't, because they just had no tagging in place. Things had been successful. They didn't think they needed to worry about it in the past. So then they had to go through exactly this exercise to figure out, what if this stuff makes money? What if it doesn't? What can we switch off and leave a landing page that says, we'll be back when the pandemic's over, or something in line that says, we're not making any money, so we don't want to spend as much right now. And being able to tie that ideally to a business outcome, but at least to which service you're using, so that in your business map that our booking system maybe is not as important as our front end web page to show that we've got a presence, versus without a booking system, we're not making any money because we can't collect any revenue, right? So knowing your business obviously has a huge impact here, but you also need to understand what's that what's that big black box in the cloud running? Is it just $400,000 a month we're throwing in there, or is there some actual business value coming from it? So I strongly agree that you need to get that process done, and if you're not already worried about it, even if times are good, something will happen, and you will need to notice at some point.
So let's say times are good, but you have nothing like this company that you described. And you guys are both technical account managers. You work with customers all the time on this, but maybe one of you or both of you could walk us through, us being the audience as well. What is a finance-led, like what should it look like? A finance-led tagging framework or a practice? And maybe even how does it differ from when it's IT-led only or engineering-led?
So I think the first thing to say is, and I'm sure with going on from Sam's example, actually, that it's not that common to see a nice, fully mandated, widespread tagging strategy in the first place. Tagging strategies tend to, or at least tagging methodologies or tagging processes, tend to kind of follow along behind requirements. And I think it's a truism to say, when you're trying to put a platform in, or when you're trying to develop a platform, or you're trying to build a capability, things like tagging maybe get left behind. So they're quite often things you have to retrospectively do, or you have to do for a particular reason, which makes them an overhead and makes them quite difficult. I think when you start talking about a finance led or a finance involved, I'm going to call slightly less controversial, but one where finance is involved, I think there's a few things there, obviously. So I think what as good best practice, you need to come up with a strategy, and you need to stick with it, and you need to try and mandate it, and you need to have methods out there to detect when tagging isn't going on, and you need to kind of chase it up. That all costs a bit of money, right? And that all requires a bit of intention and a bit of effort. And as I've discussed, I think that when you involve finance or the business in that process of identifying cloud costs, um, and and I don't think there's anything special. Just to go back to the actual question, I don't think there's anything special about a finance-led tagging strategy, because it's just a tagging strategy with maybe 5 or 6 tags, given over to identifying costs for the business, right? The the thing is not the strategy itself. The thing is the execution, and this is what I've been talking about. The thing is this collaborative approach where everything is tagged, and everything that is tagged with a business tag or tags that is agreed with the business and with finance. And so what a finance tagging strategy looks like is a standard tagging strategy, but with finance involvement. Um, and that's got a few things, right? That's got a few kind of trade-offs. Because first of all, again, if finance understands the process and the effort and the kind of ongoing nature of tagging, it is a process. It is something that you have to work at, and it is something that is quite, it's an overhead. It's not difficult, but it's an overhead. And obviously, it's case sensitive, and you can get it wrong. And you need to automate it if you can, but that requires a bit of effort. So there's a bunch of things that require time and effort there, and it kind of helps if finance knows about those things, right? It helps if you tell finance you can't deliver this because you're delivering that, and they understand it. That's one thing. But the second aspect, and I've said it already, finance is a really good pair of eyes, or set of eyes, many pairs of eyes. I've got a slight rabbit hole there, but you know what I mean. So, if for instance I have an undertaking in my tagging to include finance or business tags, and they're looking, well, they're going to pull me up for my lack of tagging as well, and that it all kind of works together as an impetus to not accidentally forget tagging because you've got an emergency deployment on, and to not miss it out because you're pushing this new thing out and it's kind of complicated. There's lots of late nights. So I think a finance led isn't the phrase I'd use, but a finance involved
Already
tagging
printed the t-shirts with your name on it too, with your face. So the next FinOps X, it's
Led
going to
by
be your
finance.
face. Finance should be leading, tagging,
Leading the
fighting me
charge.
about it.
Oh, what the hell? I'll that.
But I think what Ian mentions though about having a process and making that, I hate to use the word, but like a living process, right? It needs to be refined over time. But what tends to happen in my experience is that technical people can, and so they will, little bit like Jurassic Park. They've realized they could, but they didn't decide whether they should. And what'll happen is if the techie guys are left alone with it, guys or girls, sorry, people, then they will tag everything with far too much. They will put 300 different tags, of which no one will ever use 299. When you're finance involved or business led or whichever term we're going to use to describe it, you realize that you don't need to put a cost center if you're not doing cross-charging internally, right? Cost center is the first one that all techies will put on. And it's a good one because people see the cost center and immediately think, oh, this has been charged by cost center. I won't spin up the 24 extra large. I'll spin up a smaller instance and save some money. But the tendency is to over tag and complexify things to a point that you're getting into you're stymieing the innovation made by the teams, right? Because they can't be bothered to go through and figure out how to tag everything the right way just to deploy an instance. Whereas if you take it the other way and focus on only the things that business need to drive an outcome, and that might be which customer is this related to, or is this customer related, or is this backend related, or whatever makes sense to you in your organization. I always think of starting with 2 or 3 tags and building them out as you go. And following the FinOps crawl, walk, run methodology, the crawl is figuring out just 2 tags, but then getting that, as Ian said, across everything.
I wanted to ask for like an example of like a type of ad that finance would think of, but engineering would not even, like, if you have an actual customer example without sharing the customer or something like that. Because I always imagine, okay, engineering broken down across products. So they're going to think about products. They're going to think about environments. Maybe they'll think about cost centers. What is an example of something that they're not going to even think about in a million years? And finance will have to come in and like, hey, we need to make sure we have this set up.
It's a good one. I had a conversation with a customer yesterday, and it was a very unusual conversation because it was the first conversation about tagging, and finance was in the room. And they very quickly, it was interesting because we started to talk about unit economics, and obviously unit economics is something which is enormously useful to the business because the costs are variable. We've covered that before, and obviously unit economics really are predicated upon very good identification of costs. And so the conversation became about what was a useful unit economic to them, because the cost per customer didn't really quite work because there were various reasons why the customer wasn't necessarily the demand driver. Actually, what the demand driver was something that the customers did. You could kind of work that out, and there was an average, but it wasn't very good. And so what it turned out that and as I kind of said to them, we're sort of developing this tagging strategy now by talking about what you want to get out of this, by talking about how you want to measure all these costs against which business demand driver that you're interested in, and that can be several. That can be lots of different things that you're asking in slightly different ways. And the infrastructure that's supporting those demand drivers might overlap. It might be the same. It might be slightly different. But what we're doing is we're effectively, by asking those questions, defining what we want to be from a DoiT perspective in an allocation. What do we want in our cost bucket, and how do we want to measure the demand driver, and therefore how do we view from a business perspective what's driving this cost and the efficiency. So it's very hard without a kind of the context of a company to say this is this is a business one, IT one. But I think that those kind of conversations where you talk about what you can deliver and what actually will enable your business from the point of view, from the perspective of business decision making, then you back engineer that into the method of identifying the cost that goes on, that underpins that business benefit, and therefore what the tag should be. And I think if you kind of you're not going to go that wrong if you name your tags based on the question that you're answering. It's like it makes life simple. And I think if it's a nice and simple one, like the cost per user or the cost per web transaction or whatever it is, call it that. And I think that's where you start kind of refining tagging as a method of delivering this capability of making business decisions. It's catastrophic without, but you can actually, it's great with, but you can actually refine it. Um, and as Sam said, I don't know what the limit for tags is now, but it's many, right? And it's much more useful to get a few very useful tags than a whole abundance of nonsense. So as cost center, great. It can be really useful. It cannot be. And I guess the other thing which you could consider is what does this enable? And another conversation I've had, this is a question I often ask because it's a really good driver for effective management of cloud resources. Is, do you cross charge, right? Is there chargeback, or is there the kind of younger brother, is there showback? Are you somehow taking these costs and displaying them to either a budget holder or a group of people and holding them responsible, holding them accountable for their generation of cost? And that's a really powerful one. And I quite often get the response, or I hear the response, well, we can't really. We're not able, we'd like to, but we don't cross charge because it's very complicated, or we don't really, have that data. I think when you have finance in the room, when you're developing these things, when you're working this stuff out, and you're delivering the finance capability through these processes, then you're not a million miles away from thinking, well, can we use this to cross charge you? Well, yes, you can, or charge back, yes, you can, or show, well, of course you can. So I think that's the sort of benefit you'd expect as the process goes on. The living process, Sam.
I did have one interesting tag. I know we're going long on this answer, but I did have one interesting tag a couple of days ago with a customer, which challenged my thinking of cloud. I've been doing FinOps since before it became a term, and for the first time ever, I had someone challenge me on the CapEx versus OpEx of cloud. Now we think always of cloud as being a switch from the traditional CapEx approach to the OpEx approach, where we're paying for a resource as we're using it. And you might be able to convince me that things like upfront payments for a marketplace or for a subscription, a savings plan, or a committed use discount, you can't do that with Google, but upfront payments, maybe you can amortize and therefore call them CapEx of some sort. But interestingly, this particular customer had a different approach, and that was that certain outputs from the processing they do result in assets that they can reuse, and therefore those assets have an intrinsic value, which means that they have a capital and they can therefore be CapEx instead of OpEx. Now, that's far too deep in the weeds for finance for me, and I don't know if that makes sense, but the tag they wanted was FinOps, CapEx versus OpEx. So that was, those kinds of things, I think, show that there's always something that someone else knows more deeply. And so maybe we don't know what all the tags might be. But if they're not in the room, we're never going to find out.
Yeah. Let's say someone does like a finance person does all this, or maybe it's a FinOps practitioner. How do they measure the success of this, whether it started from scratch or the success of inserting finance at the table? How do you know whether your efforts are successful? Like, are there specific metrics that you've seen customers use, or is it just one?
I think let's get back to basics, because this is where I think a lot of customers are really. We talk highfalutin, ever finer unit economics, and actually, a lot of people are doing are struggling to allocate their costs. So I think that's the first thing, right? Is how are your costs allocated? Now, when we started this, or in the last podcast, we were talking about the impact of not doing this, right? So the impact of not allocating any costs and passing that allocations through to finance, so they understand what these things are, and that's really, that's the impact. It's kind of easy in one sense to measure your success, because it's the lack of the chaos of not doing it, right? And I think it comes down to two things, right? Number one, how are you getting the right allocations, Matt? Are you in a process that updates or changes or challenges or does something with those allocations. That's the first thing. Is there a process going on? And the second thing is how close are we to completion? And that's, that's the whole kind of, with AWS, you can say, okay, for each one of these, let's say you're structurally well aligned and you've got accounts for everything. Well, in each account, how much is not tagged? Or if I've got, something I can identify as being this team or that team, how much is not tagged? Or if I've got something that's, I think, how much is shared? Because ultimately, if I don't have a process, as far as finance is concerned, everything is shared. So if that's 100%, that is bad, right? If that's 60%, that means I've got 40% allocated. It's not great, but it's significantly better than 100%. If I'm down to 30% untagged or unallocated, again, now we're talking about numbers that start to resemble real things, particularly, and we mentioned before, if I've focused on important things first, right? So if I focused on what I think is really important, then I might be, with 30% left untagged of my entire estate. My important bits might be pretty much there. They might be like 80, 90%, which is properly useful, which is genuinely useful. I can work with that because there's a plus or minus that I can predict on that, and I can, monitor and report on stability, and I can forecast. I can do all that sort of stuff. So I think very, very simple. Do I have allocations in place that are useful to me? Do I have cost buckets that represent the business benefits that I'm interested in? And am I making progress in tagging all of this stuff? You can get a lot more complex than that, but I think fundamentally start simple and get the process out there.
So it's like a percentage tagged or percentage allocated, and then
Yeah.
how much is that percentage allocated or percentage percentage allocated going up, or that percentage allocated going down month over month, quarter over quarter?
Yeah, absolutely. Now you could do things like you could look for new resources, stuff that hasn't been out there very long, and seeing if they're tagged to the same proportion as the existing. And if it's worse, then things are getting worse. If it's higher, then things are getting better. Things like that give you some kind of indication that progress is being made. Are very powerful KPIs, because you've got to you've got to monitor this process, and you've got to feed it back, and you've got to um, gamify it where you can, right?
Gamify.
And whatever process you're using, whatever things going on, you need progress. You need to manage it. You need those KPIs. So that's very fundamentally useful. But when it comes to finance side of things, they've got to know how useful and how realistic their data is. And it's a case of saying, right, well, let's split everything evenly between whatever it is we're doing, and there we are. That's how it is. It's really unreliable, but at least it's a number, and every month, ideally, you would get better and better. You get closer and closer to something which is trustworthy and something which becomes more and more useful.
I think it's also an important point that to track the success of your FinOps program, in this particular instance, we're actually tracking how much we've tagged, not how much we've saved. And a lot of people get confused when they're trying to do FinOps or not confused, possibly too heavily focused on how many dollars have I saved. When FinOps isn't just, we've said before, it's not just cost optimization. It's not just how many dollars I've saved. It's understanding where my money's going. And so by getting that tagging and focusing on how much have I tagged, not how much have I saved, what you're driving is the success of your FinOps program rather than the success of your business, which will have the flow-on impact of success to the business. But I think it's very important that as people are looking at things like that progress cycle from FinOps, to not always get bogged down in what did we do to reduce costs this time around, and more, what are we doing to better understand our business?
I've seen customers. I've heard of stories of customers who, at least in our product, you can allocate cloud resources into these buckets, and then anything that isn't in a bucket is on this by default. It's called unallocated, and then you can query and dig into that unallocated bucket. You can maybe break it down by service, so you can see, okay, compute engine is 50% of unallocated. Let me break down the resources to see that, because that's my quickest win to reduce. It's a taggable resource. It's EC2 or GCE, whatever. You can tag it with something existing, and it'll automatically be captured by the rules of the allocation that you set up, and then boom, you've increased your visibility by 50%, or basically you've removed 50% of the unallocated bucket in this hypothetical. So it makes
That
sense,
was
kind of like.
also sorry, Fury,
Go ahead.
finish off.
That was it. I was
also going to say you can also take that another step and check whether they're accurately tagged or whether they're correctly tagged. Now, the difference between accurate and correct here: correct is has the end user developer used the correct tag name and one of the correct values from our dictionary of possibilities, and that could be whether it's your cost center or your app name or whatever. Are they all doing it with the right capitalization? As Ian mentioned, these things are case sensitive. Correctness is that person really tagging the right thing for the right workload, right? And there's a slight difference between those two. But within our console, we can get one of those. We can't do correctness necessarily, but we can certainly check that the tags match the right values that they should, and we can report on the things that don't, or we can make the choice to say, that's all right, we know what they mean, we can lump them all together, using either regex or some logic statements there. So it really does help you to quickly and powerfully figure out where those costs are, where those tags are not, and get that sorted out.
Yeah, and make sure when you're doing these checks, and they're very easy to do, that you're not just checking that it has a tag. So it's not one of the NA label NA, selection. You are actually, if you're talking about business finance tagging, you want to make sure that it's got a business or finance tag. And so that, you're talking about the percentage that is now useful or reporting the business data, and maybe separately the stuff that's reporting, I don't know, automation data or security data or whatever it is you're using for your tags. A tag isn't this, it's not one thing for everybody.
Going back to bringing in engineering again into the conversation. You mentioned, or you alluded, sometimes finance or struggles with the technical aspects of cloud, and they don't need to know everything, right, as much as the engineers. But what can the engineering team or the technical kind of folks, what can they do to kind of bridge the knowledge gaps where it needs to be bridged?
So the challenge for engineering is that they're at the sharp end. They're going to do all this stuff, right? So they've got to manage the processes, and they've got to. I glibly say it's great because you give these tags to finance, and they become your tagging police. It's IT that they're policing. It's all very well to give them this power, but they're going to put pressure on IT. But I think I keep coming back to this. That this is a collaborative process, and it is really important that IT is not just under pressure from finance to reduce costs, which is what happens when it all breaks down, right? We've talked about this before. Capping capping cloud costs. With cloud costs are too high, they've got to kind of bring the whole cloud cost down by arbitrary percentage. Insert your number here, kind of thing. And I think if IT understands that this is a symptom of a problem, it's not just finance getting on their case because they want to. This is a symptom of a problem, and the business isn't working well because of this. And it's a problem that IT can help to fix. I think the key, really, what IT can really do, IT engineering can do, is understand the problem. I think this is one of the reasons why I trot this out to my customers so often, is because you tend to find IT thinks that, and it's correct, right? Tagging is all about managing and monitoring the equipment. It's all about things like efficiency. It's all about understanding, cost and all that kind of stuff. It's not necessarily about allowing the business to forecast. And I think when IT understands that, and IT can work with, not just take requests and meet them, but work with finance in a basis, though, because finance doesn't, people from finance aren't technical. They don't necessarily they don't know the ins and outs of how this stuff works. What you do need is someone who does know, but who understands their problem, to present potential solutions to them. And I think that's really where an ongoing collaboration starts to bear fruit, is where each can understand the problems and the challenges of the other and work together to fix them, rather than IT is really going, well, finance is really getting on my case. How the hell are we going to do this? Let's just shut the thing off. These are real things you hear from people. And I did hear somebody once told me, I asked them a question about finance, and they laughed and said, finance hates the cloud. which again showed a very very fundamental breakdown. But this is really what we're trying to fix, and this is really what that ongoing relationship can do. So, key to answer your question, IT and or engineering should doesn't have to do the finance, but it's to understand the problems the finance is up against and help them.
A little more empathy.
A little bit more empathy, yeah.
A little more empathy in a shared language, right? We've spoken about on the previous episode that a huge part of FinOps is those guys don't want to understand the tech and those guys don't want to understand the finance. So let's give them a language they can talk together about the bits that do matter. Some empathy and some understanding is going to be needed in there, and certainly some listening. So it's not going to be a job for every engineer, and it's not going to be a job for every finance person. But having a couple of people that can talk about that and make sure that the two teams understand what's needed from each other and what the reason for that requirement is, drives us a long way.
Is it kind of to wrap it up? Is it fair to say, like, if you're jumping into this, either you have tags already, there's no tags, you should try to ask yourself, maybe your team, maybe the CEO, if they're involved, kind of what business questions we want to answer with tags. What do we currently have today? And does any of what we have today match with the questions that need to be answered? If not, what tags would answer those questions? And then you basically have an IT person that you're working with alongside, so they're in sync.
Because I think if you sit a room full of IT and finance people and ask them, what are the FinOps questions you're not answering, there's a good chance that they won't know. And so this is, I think, where the education part, firstly, precisely the point of this this podcast is, why are we doing this in the first place? What problems are we looking to alleviate? How do we go about alleviating them? How do we specifically because it's always slightly different, which FinOps tools you choose to use. But those kind of just that understanding, first of all, of what we're trying to achieve. I think that's the first step. If you can get something like that, if you can start talking in terms, and it's kind of why I tend to use unit for finance anyway. I think IT is obviously very close to this stuff, and kind of get in broad terms that it's important to forecast, right? It's not a huge stretch. It's quite difficult sometimes to get, if I'm honest, to get finance interested. And the last thing you want to do is to walk into a finance room and tell them that they're doing their finance wrong when you're not in finance. That's not a position you want to be in. But I think that one effective way of doing it for me anyway is discussing the benefits of, I've said it before, unit economics. Because if you can start from that perspective, just imagine if you could see what the cost per this would be, would that help? If you could see the cost for that, would that help? Well, what else would really help? And that kind of opens the floodgates, because you're talking in business terms. And then, you as the sort of FinOps practitioner or the engineering manager, whatever it is you are, you back engineer that into something that, that you can use, but you can also kind of keep finance in on the journey so that they understand that's what you're doing.
An example of this, if you're like, whenever I talk about unit economics, I think of Uber as the easiest example, but imagine it's like this, their finance leader, their CFO, or maybe some controller, finance person, whatever, would maybe, we just rolled out Uber for helicopters. We want to make sure we're pricing this correctly. We need to find out our cost per ride, maybe in aggregate, because also we would probably know our revenue per rider, but then we also want to break it down, which of these, is a Uber Black profitable? Is that better than Uber X? Should we be pricing Uber X more versus the helicopter versus, I don't know, the other modes of transportation? But that would be like an example of maybe an internal conversation they're having with themselves or with the team.
Absolutely. And I think when you look at the cost, when you look at the cost of an Uber ride, using that example, if you're just getting started, you might know that you get a percentage on a ride. But as you mentioned, there's an aggregate and there's an average. And once you start diving into that, once you've got that basic information and the first set of tags and cost of goods sold, you realize, well, actually there's a cost for setting the ride up, There's a different cost for tracking the ride with the mapping and so on during the ride. And then there's a different cost for accepting payment and asking for a tip, sending an email. So you can break down each of the components along the way and then get into the back-end systems of each of those and get more and more detailed into your essentially microservices. But if you try to boil the ocean, if you try and get that from your first pass, you're going to get in real trouble. If you start off with cost per ride, that's a good place to start with helicopters, unicorns, or taxis, whatever you're booking.
Yeah.
Essentially exactly what I was going to say. You start building out all the costs that contribute to your cost of goods sold. I was thinking, your car park where you park your Ubers in overnight, whatever it is, the paint jobs to make them look nice, or the licensing, or for the anything and everything, and you build up your cost. This is Cloud Plus, right? You start building up your entire costs, and make things much more readily available, easy to see, and really make those unit economics work.
And on that note, I think we're good to sign off. That sets us up for our last of this kind of mini series within our podcast series on FinOps. We're going to talk more about unit economics, Cloud Plus. So if that interests you, if you're at that stage, or you want to prepare, or you're just curious, check out the next episode on unit economics. And thanks for listening. We'll see you in the next episode.